Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Providend's Money Wisdom Podcast. I'm your host, Isaac, Associate Advisor at Providend. Join with me today is founder and CEO of Providend and co-host of this podcast, Christopher Tan. Hi Chris.
Hey, hi Isaac.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time today to review your article that you have written for the BT.
It's good to be back.
So as most of you probably know, we do monthly reviews on articles that Chris writes for the Business Times. And usually this episode is hosted by Natalie, who is the deputy head of brand experience at Providend. But because she's away on maternity leave.
She's a happy mother now.
Yes. So I'll be hosting the rest of these episodes till the end of this year. So for this this month's article is titled Choosing a Wealth Advisor that will most likely do the right things for you. As you know, the article was originally titled slightly different. It was Choosing a Wealth Advisor that will always do the right things for you. So how do you feel about that? They did a slight amendment to this.
I guess BT is doing what they are supposed to do. Because I guess, because I'm the one who wrote the article, right? So I'm biased. So I was very absolute to say that, if advisory firm, they have these attributes, then they will always do the right thing for you. I mean, that's my opinion. But I guess the Business Times, being a paper that they want to be neutral, so they change it to most likely, which is not wrong.
Yeah, that's
right?
understandable.
Because, we are all human, we're all fallible, and it is possible that even if you have these three attributes that I wrote for the article, it's still possible that an advisor may do the wrong thing. So I think it's not wrong to be more neutral to say most likely. But at least it's most likely. It's better than without these three attributes. I think it's harder for the advisory firm to make sure that the client advisors will always do the right thing. And I started the article by saying, that's the common question that we get from webinars. We always say we are fee only, right? But the participants of the webinars, they are asking us, like, okay, so how do you ensure? Is it just fee? Yeah, that's why I wrote the three attributes, which I think should help an advisory firm do the right things for their clients.
Right, so you wrote this Business Times article as a follow-up to a previous one that you did a few months ago. So what inspired you to write these two articles? And as it is linked to the article that we're going to talk about today, could you give us a brief recap on what you wrote previously?
Yeah, so I wrote the first article a few months ago. I think the title was Mitigating the Conflicts in the Financial Advisory Industry, something like that. Yeah. And the first article, I wrote it because it's been a long time since I wrote about the compensation structure in our industry. I think the last time I wrote about an article like this was probably maybe a decade ago, and it's interesting that earlier this year, a lot of the interviews I went for, the podcast, even on media, it's interesting that I get questions like, so what's the difference between fee-based, and commission-based? And I had to correct people that we are not fee-based, we are fee-only. And there is a difference between fee-based and fee-only. So I felt that, okay, maybe it's time that I write again to explain the various compensation structure in the advisory industry, in the wealth advisory industry. And it's not just Singapore, but globally, there are three ways advisors are compensated. Or rather, three ways advisory firms are compensated: commission-based, fee-based, which means to say that the advisory firm will take a fee, but they also take the commissions. And of course, Providend, we are fee-only, which means to say that we don't take commissions. It's 100% based on fees. I also wrote in the article that although for the advisory firms, there are three ways they are compensated, for advisors, there are actually four ways. Right? So advisors can be commission-based, they can also be fee-based, they can be fee-only, but they can also be salary-based. Right? And I wrote about why I think that even if a person is salary-based, it doesn't mean that there is no conflict of interest. Because as long as the advisory firm, they collect commissions, there's always a way whereby advisory firms may influence the advisors to do a certain thing, right? And of course, I think when I first wrote the article many years ago, I was very, very convinced that fee only is the only way. Right. And I wrote in the article that now I'm more mature because having gone through 20 years of, more than 20 years of experience in this, we have tried different models. I felt that for fee only, it's really suitable for the more affluent. For the man in the street, I think that they may not be able to afford the fees, and truly they should not pay a fee for advice because their situation is a lot simpler. So I felt, I wanted to share my opinion. So that was the first motivation, or rather that's the motivation for my first article. But I said that beyond compensation, there are other factors consumers should be looking out for in choosing a trusted advisor for themselves. It's not just compensation alone. Yes, compensation is important because compensation will tell you whether an advisor is conflicted, but that's not the only factor. And I said that the other factors would be whether a firm, they institutionalized their practice. The culture of the firm is very important. And I promised in the first article that I will write something about it. And that's the reason why I wrote the second piece. And the focus is really more on how advisory firm will institutionalize the practice and the importance of building a very strong firm culture.
Right, for listeners who are interested, we also had a podcast episode on the article as well. So links to the article and the podcast episode are in the description of the podcast below. So in your latest article, you talked about why Providend institutionalizes our advisory and investment process. So what does this mean exactly? And how is it different compared to other firms or institutions in the wealth management industry?
Yeah, I think many firms in Singapore, and not just in Singapore, around the world, especially in Southeast Asia, they are really like a collection of agencies, right? Many of the financial advisory firms in Singapore, they started from insurance agencies, direct, tied agencies. And then, of course, when the Financial Advisors Act was put in place, many came out and then they set up their own financial advisory firm, and they brought along that same model, right, of the tied agency. Right, and what that means is that these financial advisory firms, they are actually like platforms. They provide compliance, they provide maybe admin support, they provide tech support, they provide office space, and then they hire all these advisors who are really just self-employed. And of course, some of these advisors becomes managers, and then they hire their own advisors, and this thing goes on. So it's really a collection of agencies. And because it's a collection of agencies, if you belong to agency one, you might be doing a different thing, and your way of advice might be different from agency two of the same financial advisory firm.
Right.
So the whole process, the way of giving advice is not institutionalized, right? Even in terms of investment management, very much is left to the managers of these agencies to decide how they want to do it, right? And the managers actually they got full power to decide the kind of products that they want to sell to their clients. And in fact, even the reps, they have the right. They can choose what kind of products they want to sell to their clients. So that's what I mean by the whole process is not institutionalized. And of course, in the article, I explain the problem. I don't want to talk about it here because you can actually go to the article and read about the problems that as a consumer you will face if you are working with a firm that the whole process may not be institutionalized.
Right, so let's go into in terms of quality of wealth advice. So why is consistency important when it comes to quality of advice given to clients?
I think from a consumer standpoint, you want to know that there is a standard of advice in the firm, right? You want to know that when you go to a firm and you see 3 different advisors, 4 different advisors, 5 different advisors, and you tell these 5 different advisors the same thing, you should be able to live with the same recommendation. Right. Of course, the experience will be slightly different because different advisors will have different style. They have different what I call bedside manners. Your chemistry, different advisors will be different. But in terms of recommendation, it should be by and large the same if that process is consistent, right? And from an advisory firm standpoint, if there is no consistency in advice, it's very hard to actually monitor whether your advisor is doing the right thing. Now, when I say the right thing, I don't mean compliance. Sure, you can monitor compliance. But a person who complies to the law does not mean that this person may be giving competent advice. Right? I'm just complying to the law. I'm doing the bare minimum of what the law requires of me. That's compliance, right? So having a consistent process will allow the firm to be able to monitor whether the advisor is actually doing the right thing for the client, because it's an absolute standard, right? And if the advisor is not doing the right thing, at least certain corrective action can be done.
Right, so without that, actually the only metric would be their sales performance in that case. If you don't have, if your whole process is not consistent, really the only metric that a supervisor can look at is really in terms of hard numbers, it will be the sales numbers.
Yeah, which is the problem, right? Because I think I've always said that unfortunately the industry somehow recognize sales performance more than quality advice. Right, all the awards that are given out there, they are really not a measure of the standard of advice. They are really a measure of how much sales an advisor can do. Now, I'm not saying that's bad completely, right? Because it's still a business. You still need to measure whether the advisors they are bringing the business in. But I think that's not the only thing we should be measuring. We should be measuring quality advice, right? And without an absolute standard, it's very hard to decide whether an advisor pass or fail, right? Especially if there's for a firm that's got a few hundred advisors and all the different advisors are doing their own thing, different thing. How would an advisory firm measure whether the advisors are actually giving good advice? Because there's no absolute standard. Right? There's no absolute standard. There's nothing to measure against.
Yeah, so there's this fallacy that, if you sell more, it means you're giving good advice.
Which is completely illogical.
Yes.
Right? So, unfortunately, that's the case right now. And that's why for us at Providend, more than 20 years ago, we have decided that we don't want to do this. We are not going to participate in any of those sales awards because we want to focus on building an advisory organization more than a sales organization.
Okay, thanks for that, Chris. So, more specifically, just now you touched on the area of investment management. So in your article, you wrote that if all decisions were decentralized in terms of investment management, the firm may not know the rationale of each decision made by their representative. So could you unpack that a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, okay, I'm not even going to use 100 advisors or 300 advisors in a firm, right? I'm just going to use an example. Let's say advisory company has got 10 advisors. Right? If we have no control over how the advice is being given, we have no control over how the management is being invested. It's not centrally managed. So every advisor would have different asset allocation for their clients. So if each advisor has got, say, 100 clients, right? The advisor may create for themselves maybe 10 portfolios of different asset allocation. The next advisor will create another 10 portfolios with different asset allocation based on different rationale.
I would like to clarify that it's for the same type
same
of
for the same
clients,
company,
so because different
right?
asset allocation is fine.
Yeah.
But if we're talking about the same types of client with same or rather similar particular needs, you can have different asset allocation.
Yeah. If I want to be more specific, right, to make it even easier for the listeners to understand, let's just say that Providend has only 2 advisors, Isaac and Chris, right? And Isaac decided to create 10 different portfolios for his clients. And say for Isaac, his most conservative portfolio, let's say it's 100% bonds, okay, and then maybe 30% equities, 70% bonds for the other portfolios or for the next portfolio, okay, and another portfolio could be 40% equities, 60% bonds, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Chris will do the same, but now Chris' most conservative portfolio will be 10% equities, 90% bonds, right? And the next 2 portfolios will be different from Isaac completely. And to make matters worse, Isaac will use different funds, different ETF to execute those portfolios. And Chris will also use different ones, right? Depending on Isaac's and Chris' preferences, the whole portfolio will look very different. Now, let's say the market becomes very volatile. or let's say there is a huge drawdown, as a firm, it is now very difficult to make a decision on what to do and what to communicate to these clients, because ISAC clients will have a different asset allocation as compared to Chris's clients, and ISAC clients will be holding different funds and different ETFs as compared to ISAC client. Now multiply this with 50, 100, 300 advisors. So from a firm standpoint, because the portfolios are not centrally managed, it is actually very hard for the company to communicate to their clients, okay, don't worry, your portfolio is fine. Because truly, the company cannot know whether the portfolios are fine, right? Because they don't know exactly what each of the 100, 300 advisors are using. And so the company will then really have to depend on the individual advisor to communicate to their clients on what to do. And again, we go back to that problem of then the firm cannot ensure that the advisors will be doing it. They cannot ensure that the advisor is saying the right thing. They cannot ensure that quality. So that's the problem with if the investment is not centrally managed.
Yeah, so actually, it's also a good transition to the next point of your articles, which is regarding succession or handover of clients. As you know, in this industry, sometimes people would change companies, sometimes they will retire, and you have to hand over your book of clients. Based on what you have shared just now, you highlighted that without institutionalizing the process, it will put the client in a disadvantageous position. So could you just maybe elaborate a bit more on this?
Yeah, so using the same example, right? Yeah. So I decided to retire. And now I'm going to find someone to take over my clients. Okay, and if I'm a responsible advisor, I will find someone, right? If I won't say irresponsible, okay? If I cannot find anyone, I just retire, then my clients are on their own, right? Yeah. And say, for example, somehow my clients found out about ISAC, and all my clients are going to go to ISAC. Now, ISAC will look at my client's portfolio, and then it's not what he preferred.
Yeah, we might have conflicting philosophies.
Views, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so then what's going to happen, right? You're going to take over the plans, and your assumptions of planning for clients may be different from mine, right? There's no standard, right? So the client will have to go through that whole process of replanning all over again, and maybe even the portfolio, there's going to be a lot of changes and all that. So that's the problem when it's not institutionalized. I think for us, because we institutionalize not just our advisory, we also institutionalize our investment management. Today, if Chris retire, if I hand over all my files to you, I said, you will take over the file. It's a very smooth transition, right? Because you know exactly why I planned that way. You have no problems with the portfolio because our philosophy is consistent. The instrument used will be the same. It's a very smooth transition for the clients.
So, could you briefly explain then how we institutionalize our process? We have been talking about the problems that other firms face if they don't institutionalize their process. But why does it enable us to do the right things for our clients?
I think at the onset, when we hire someone to be an advisor, we tell them that this is the way we practice it. You cannot have your own preference. It doesn't mean you cannot have your say, right? Of course, you can have your say. You can share your views and opinions about investments, about advice and all that. But after sharing, the leadership is always taken by the head of solutions or the head of investments, right? Now, next, every one of us, we use the same tool, right? There's no difference in whether ISAC a selection of tools or Chris selection of tools. We use the same tools. We use the same planning philosophy. Our investment philosophy is exactly the same throughout the firm. Our methodology of, say, planning for someone in retirement, everyone here uses Retire Well, right? We have the same planning assumptions. And all these things are actually archived or captured in the advisor's planning guide. And you all know that you are an associate advisor yourself, Isaac. You know we have an advisor's planning guide that everyone needs to adhere to. So if the firm uses a certain inflation assumption, we use that inflation assumption, right? If the firm uses expected return of portfolios, which I think I wrote an article about it as well. Yeah. The investment team decides based on a scientific approach to estimate the expected return. That's captured in the advisor's planning guide. Everybody uses the same advisor's planning guide. In terms of insurance, philosophy is the same. the solutions team come and then they do a research. And for example, for hospitalization plan, there is a recommended plan for advisors to use, right? In terms of investment, the advisors are not supposed to create their own asset allocation. It's all done by the investment team. The investment team manages it. In fact, even with the instrument, the investment team, they are the one that chooses this instrument for the advisors to use. We use direct bonds for our clients, right? And when there is a bond in the secondary market or even a new bond that's out there, the investment team looks at it and then they blast it out to the advisor and say, okay, these bonds, if you want, you can use it for your clients. So this is how we institutionalize the entire advisory and investment process.
Right, there's many moving parts in our plan. I mean, even based on the assumptions that you mentioned, 2% inflation assumption, 3%, 4%, you get vastly different outcomes, or even planning returns, a change in 1-2%, if you extrapolate it out for 20 years, for example, the difference is huge.
Yeah, I mean, 1% doesn't sound like it's a lot, but like you said, it gets compounded, right? And so it can be so different. And another reason, and I do not know whether you're going to ask me this question, Isaac, but I might as well answer it now. Another reason why we decide to institutionalize the process is because I have always taken the stand that no one person can be an expert in every area. No way, right? How can you as an advisor be an expert in estate planning, legacy planning, insurance planning, investment planning, retirement planning? There's no way you can do that, right? And so what we have decided to do is that we have decided to put the right people to decide those things, right? When it comes to expected returns, the people who are trained in investment should be doing it, right? The advisors are expert in general advice. They are expert in general financial planning, wealth planning, retirement planning. They focus on that. They are expert in knowing actually what the client wants, right? But the investment team, they are expert in investment. Let them be the one that set the assumptions. Yeah. So in this way, then we would be able to give competent advice to the clients because we have the best people doing that role.
So let's move on to the last point of your article, which is building a strong, firm culture. So I always mention that when I joined Providend, I was surprised by how culture is taken so seriously. In my previous employments, culture was always kind of a token initiative. They always say, oh, this is our culture. But here we have many meetings and discussions, often involving senior management, to ensure that our culture remains strong. So in your article, you mentioned a quote from Peter Drucker, an esteemed management consultant who said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So could you explain what this means in this context?
Yeah. Well, so the late Peter Drucker, he is really well respected for management ideas. And he had this quote that culture eats strategy alive for breakfast. And what that really means is that you can have a fantastic strategy, but if you don't have the right people to actually execute those strategy, your best strategy will be worth nothing. And culture is about having the right people. And not just having the right people, but the right people who behaves in a certain way, especially when no one is watching. Right? And only with the right culture, then a good strategy can be executed. So that's what Peter Drucker meant, right? When he says that, you can have a great strategy, but culture will eat it alive. If you have a very bad culture, it doesn't matter you have a great strategy. Your company is still going to fail. So that's what Peter Drucker meant.
Right, Chris, so could you briefly explain, it's an impossible ask, could you briefly explain what our Providend culture is? I laugh because, sometimes when we talk about culture, it can take many hours, especially, when we think about our annual retreat, for example, and we talk about culture, it can really go on and on. But if you can, could you briefly explain what our Providend culture is?
Yeah, I think very few people believe that we are so crazy about culture. Right, and Isaac, you are in the team that helps the company build culture, and you know how crazy we are. We talk about culture all the time, right? And in fact, we are so serious that and we've done it before. You can be very clever, you can be very smart, but if you don't fit the culture, we are very sorry. Now, we can't have you here. I think to build a culture, we first need to define what kind of culture do we want, right? And for Providend, that culture is embedded in our core values, which is the acronym is SPIRIT, SPIRIT. We call it the spirit of Providend, as well as our corporate purpose. Right? The spirit of Providend, if I unpack it, is a strong mind, a passionate belief, inspiring one another to run the race independently, but yet as a team. That's spirit, right? And the corporate purpose of Providend can be found on our website, but if I were to summarize it and reduce it to something that we can all remember, is to first help our clients make life decisions, before making financial decisions, and then we give our clients honest, independent, and competent advice to make those financial decisions. So that is the culture. It's encapsulated in the core values as well as the corporate purpose. And this culture, well, it sounds like it is just more suitable for the advisory team, but actually it permeates every department, right? Because for the spirit of Providend, it is pretty generic, strong mind, passionate belief, inspiring one another, right? To run the race independently as a team. Yeah, it applies to the people team, it applies to the finance team. But if you think about it, it also applies to the advisory team, right? Because if we continually build these core values and we do many activities for people to live out these core values, and we talk about these core values all the time, right? Then, for example, in advisory, sometimes even if you are tempted to do the wrong thing for the client, right? That core value of a strong mind, that passionate belief in doing the right thing, right, should stop you from doing the wrong thing, right? And because you belong to a culture that everybody thinks the same way, right? If suddenly, Isaac, you say something that may be good for your quote-unquote sales, but may not be good for the client, you'll be frowned upon. Yeah. Right? Nobody's going to celebrate that, right? You're going to be frowned upon. Somebody's going to correct you and say, hey, Isaac, is that the best thing for the client? Because that's what we talk about all the time, right? But if you do the right thing, right, you're going to get recognized because part of the core value is inspiring one another, right? So that's what our culture is all about. And that's how our culture is able to execute that strategy, that process of doing the best thing for client. I'll say one last thing before. I know you're dying to ask me a question. I can see from your face you're dying to ask me a question. But I'll just say one last thing about the corporate purpose, okay? The corporate purpose was written, I can't even remember when, it was in the 2000s. But the corporate purpose has helped Providend management team made many difficult decisions, right? Each time when we wanted to make a decision and seemingly they are not good for the business, the management team actually brought out the purpose statement and say, hey, but that's what we said we will do. Honest, independent, competent is what we want to do now. Honest is what we're going to do now, competent? Are they independent for our clients? Right. So that purpose statement, we actually take it very seriously. The seniors will tell you that there were a few occasions we have to revisit this purpose statement to help us make the correct decisions for our clients.
Right. So we always joke, internally, especially when we're talking about culture with the founding members, with Chris, yourself. It can go really long. I think our listeners had a taste of how, when we start this conversation or start this topic.
Yeah, it doesn't end. And sometimes, I mean, I've spoken to other people before and they will tell me that, when their bosses or CEO comes and they talk about core values, they laugh. They secretly text each other and say, here the boss goes again. And they laugh because they know the boss is not serious about it. It's all just paying lip service, right? And life goes on, right? But, for us, like I say, we literally breathe our culture all the time.
Yeah, and it permeates through the whole process as well. I mean, I remember a personal story of I was preparing for the interview. I spent the past week reading up on the efficient market hypothesis, refreshing my investment knowledge, refreshing my insurance knowledge, reading up on Providend's philosophies. So I was getting all prepared. And then when I went to the interview, I feel that, most, if not all, the interview was really about my character, my values. There's hardly any technical kind of questions, which I was quite shocked. It's not something that we just say. It actually is very deeply embedded in all our the hiring process
Yeah. And those things, honestly, you can't really prepare for. Right? I mean, it's not like exam you can prepare and study, right? Because we can tell. We've been doing this for the last 20 years. We can tell when a person comes, that conversation, the person, we can tell whether these values oozes out from him, right? I mean, we ask them to share life experiences, and we can tell whether this person will fit us in terms of the culture. Anyway, I mean, I believe in it so much that's why I wrote in the article that, the culture is like the software that runs the hardware, right? Because you can have the hardware, right? And every company can institutionalize the practice. It's not difficult. Okay. Not that easy.
It's not easy.
Not that easy. Well, but it's doable, right? It's doable. So you can have the hardware. You can even put in place a fee-only practice, right? But it is the software that is very hard to replicate. To get a group of like-minded people to come together to believe in a certain thing, and not just believe, do it on a daily basis, to have that community of practice is very important. Right? Imagine this. Imagine that you work for a firm that day in, day out talks about how much commission I'm going to make from this product, how many more months before I make $1 million round table. If you are in an environment like that, you will be like that. Now, again, I'm not saying that means you're dishonest. No, don't get me wrong. Right? I'm just saying that if you are in a culture like that, then that is your dominant thought every day. Right? But if you are in a culture whereby you are talking about best practice, our WhatsApp, what do we talk about in our WhatsApp group all the time?
We're trying to find the best thing to implement for our clients. We found something, and then we have arguments sometimes, on what's best
and
for
technical
the client.
papers, and all those things, right? I mean, it's crazy. People talk late into the night, all those things. So, I mean, but if you are immersed in that environment, well, the Bible says that out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Whatever you put inside you, it just comes out, right? So if you're in an environment that everything goes into you, is all the correct thing you must do for the client, best practices, what comes out from you will be those things. And that's why the culture part, that community part is so important.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris, for sharing, and also for coming on for this episode, and really for your 20 years that you have been with Providend, pouring your heart and soul into this company to create a company with such a strong culture and good processes, and enabling us to do what's best for the people in Singapore.
Thanks, Isaac. Thanks for having me back again.
That's all for this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed our episode on Chris's BT article titled Choosing a Wealth Advisor That Will Most Likely Do the Right Things for You. If you like this episode, follow our podcast and follow us on social media for similar contents. As always, thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode. All analysis, views or opinions from interviews, recommendations and other information broadcasted, podcasted or published herein are provided for general information purposes only. Information expressed does not take into account any specific situation, particular needs or objectives, and should not be construed as specific advice or a recommendation. Information has been obtained from sources that are deemed to be reliable, but their accuracy and completeness cannot be guaranteed. Always consult with a qualified investment, legal or tax professional before taking any action. Providend Limited does not accept any liability for any loss whatsoever arising from any use of the information broadcasted, podcasted or published herein. All contents and information contained herein may not be copied or reproduced in whole or in part by any means without prior written consent of Providend Limited.